So I have just watched about two-thirds of the documentary Ukraine, the other side. I don't know the verbatim title. I think that was it, Ukraine, the other side. With my dad. I didn't watch it from the start. I watched it from about a third of the way in, roughly speaking. Um, Narrated and involving the journalist Sean Langan. Sean Langan is a very experienced journalist. He's been to a lot of the world's trouble spots. He was actually kidnapped in Afghanistan on the Afghan-Pakistan border at one point. So this is a man who's had a lot of experience and, really fills that description of the courageous frontline journalist, although he probably wouldn't attach that to himself. Um, but it just reiterates the risks these people take and why I have such admiration for them. Um, it's not just the physical risks and the dangers involved, it's actually the practical side of setting everything up. Well, this documentary, he was working or embedded with, I shouldn't say working with, he was embedded with the Russian military. The Russians in eastern Ukraine, particularly focusing on the fighting around Donetsk and other areas of the frontline fighting in that part of Ukraine. Very interesting documentary, sobering. Um, Not entirely surprising. It's sort of along the lines of what I thought would be, which was grim, which was Russian soldiers very much. Well, I can't say I knew what it would be, but it was. The things I noticed about this was, well, firstly, let me prefix this actually before I talk about the documentary. I want to prefix it by saying that I'm not neutral on this war. That would be nonsense. I've never been neutral. I'm absolutely pro-Ukraine, and I still maintain that position. Um, I think that whatever angle you look at in terms of siding with the Russian propaganda, even if you take the view it's to remove a Nazi government or it's to protect Russian speakers, the bottom line is Russia invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. Now, I think it's true that in any conflict, it's wrong to say that one side is totally evil and the other side is totally good. I think that is wrong. I think you can't have that black and white way of thinking. Um, I'm not Ukrainian, so I can say this. I think if I was a Ukrainian, I might feel differently, but I don't believe all the Russians are evil. I think there are Russian soldiers who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. They're just dead wrong. I think they're brainwashed by a system that puts in this irredentist propaganda in such a profound way. And it was clear to see from the interviews that he was giving to these soldiers that they were lapping up everything Putin says. It's very sad to see. I mean, I do think it's an absolute tragedy that thousands of young Russian men have died and been badly injured for the irredentist obsessions of a now elderly dictator. It's a sad thing. Of course, many Ukrainians have died as well, but they have, I think they've absolutely got the moral high ground on their side. They're defending their country. I'm sure there's been morale tested on the Ukrainian side as well, but this was what was plain to see with the way he was speaking to people. Even the army doctor on the Russian side was talking about believing in Putin and believing in, you know, of course, this was what was on camera. It has to be said that it's risky for a Russian to speak out what they may really feel about Putin. So I'd be a little bit cautious about that. I think it's absolutely true that a lot of Russians really do buy into that irredentist sort of mindset of Ukraine is Russia. I mean, they've never accepted Ukraine as a sovereign state. People could talk about 2014. They could talk about the referendum, but Russians have never accepted Ukraine as a sovereign state. At least a lot of Russians haven't. And this is the fundamental problem. It's the same mindset that China has with Taiwan. They don't give a damn what the Ukrainians think. It's Russian. There are Russian brothers. But to Ukrainian, seeing the atrocities at Bucha, Now, Kramatorsk or Mariupol, that's almost like a bad joke. Um, there is one thing I want to address that, people would say we've always seen this from the Ukrainian side, we've never heard the Russian perspective. This is not actually true because, this is one of the things that Tucker Carlson claimed, that we've never heard the Russian perspective. The fact of the matter is, Putin himself has been interviewed numerous times. He's made it very clear what this is about. Denazifying Ukraine. That's the explicit agenda of the Kremlin. At least that's what's purported. I think it's really about Putin's irredentist obsessions. But the idea that Russia hasn't had its voice heard is just nonsense. Bear in mind, Russia today, the Kremlin state mouthpiece, was operating in this country as recently as 2022. It finally changed, and I think justifiably so, because I don't think it was a journalistic platform. I don't think it was simply the Russian perspective. I think it was clearly an organ of the Russian state, in a way that you can't say the BBC is, because the BBC, it's British state broadcaster, but it is, it's separate from the British government in a way that you simply cannot compare to Russian state media. I have a big problem with these equivalencies that you sometimes hear. The BBC they'll be critical of Tory ministers in a way that they'd be critical of Rishi Sunak. You will see reports that question government ministers in a way that you would never get on Russian state TV. You just wouldn't. So I get quite frustrated with these false equivalencies. Now here you have a British journalist interviewing Russian soldiers in the Russian lines. The documentary was entirely from the Russian perspective. Would you get a situation where you get a British journalist or a Western journalist who is allowed into Russia to interview Kremlin critics? We've seen, for example, in the last few days, people have been interviewed what they think of Navalny, but increasingly there's been pressure on the press. Curiously enough, Steve Rosenberg, the BBC's main correspondent, is still operating in Moscow, but I imagine under very stressful conditions. It's incredible that he's still there. But I would point out to the track records of both sides regarding press freedom, and I just don't think there's any equivalencies. Put it this way, Russian sympathisers like Tucker Carlson can mouth off as much as he wants about Putin and about how awful the Western media is, pretty much without restriction. He's criticised, but being criticised is not the same as being silenced. It's not the same as being poisoned. So I really have a problem with moral equivalencies. But regarding the war, to get back to the basics, I don't believe all the Russian soldiers are evil. And incidentally, I don't think Ukraine's perfect. I don't think before the invasion Ukraine was perfect. There were not neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine. Of course there were, as there is in every European country. There was corruption. And there may even, dare I say it, there may even have been some discrimination against Russian speakers. But not to the extent that the Kremlin was claiming. If there was systemic persecution, would the Kremlin not have produced evidence at the UN? Significant evidence. If you believe the Kremlin's narrative, then Ukraine's run by neo-Nazis, Russian speakers are routinely brutalized. That just doesn't stack up to the lack of evidence that they've produced. I think there will be people in eastern Ukraine, particularly Donbass, that were sympathetic to Russia, may still be. But interestingly enough, after the invasion, a lot of those people changed their sentiments because they saw Russia for what it was. I think Russia today has a very similar mindset to Germany in the 30s, which is paranoia and an obsession about living space and Russian speakers. Then it was German speakers. I don't know if there's a Russian term for living space, but the very fact that they will not acknowledge Ukraine as a sovereign state tells you everything you need to know about this. And it may well be that this war ends with some sort of painful concession that the Ukrainians make, that part of their territory is conceded. But The problem is, will Russia stop there? That's the problem. Will Russia, if Ukraine just gives up the Donbass, will Russia stop there? I mean, this is the fundamental problem. Russia under Putin doesn't see Ukraine as a sovereign state. It doesn't recognize the 1991 borders. So I find it hard to believe they'll just stop there. They'll find some reason to say, well, Russian speakers are being persecuted in Kyiv and Western Ukraine, so let's invade there as well. I don't think they'll stop. And I think people who look at Russia as being the wounded party are failing to understand the nature of the Putin regime within Russia. Within Russia. Even if you feel that NATO provoked Russia, the way that Russian dissidents are treated in Russia should tell you everything you need to know about this regime. Now, when I say war isn't black and white, I don't feel that every Russian is evil, and I don't. Probably there'll be some Ukrainians who cross the line, possibly, but fundamentally they've got the moral high ground because they're defending their country. This narrative of the Ukrainian Nazis, it's obscene, particularly when you look at